Good morning. Today we'll be continuing in a series that started a while back in the letter of 1 Peter, and we'll be in chapter 3. If you would, please grab a Bible nearby if you want to follow along. 1 Peter chapter 3. And again this week, there's going to be connections between this lesson and the passage that Kurt read for us at the table. There'll be a connection between this lesson and our Bible class. And there's a connection between this lesson and the lesson that Steve Klein had for us from the Psalms this past Wednesday. So it never ceases to amaze me how connected all of the scriptures are and how these things tend to weave together without really any design or intention on our part, but we see the design on the Creator's part in His wisdom and how it all works together and fits together. You know, sometimes when you spend time in a passage, you pick up on certain patterns and themes. And here we are kind of in the middle of the book. And as I was reading for this one, I noticed a pattern that really just sort of jumped out at me. And that's really what I'm going to share with you today when we get to it. So last time we were looking at a passage in 1 Peter 3 that's really a quotation from the Psalms. And it is all about how to have a blessed life. So this is in chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, the quotation. Whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil, his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So this is a quotation from Psalm 34. And it begins, whoever desires to love life and see good days. Well, that sounds great, doesn't it? Who wouldn't want to love life and see good days? And this is really, I think, what all of us desire, right? We want to have good days. We want to enjoy our life. It sounds like a description of the blessed life, abundant life, a good life. And yet we know that the life of following the Lord includes its sorrows and trials. And in fact, this is the point that Steve Klein made. He quoted and read this very passage this past Wednesday night. It's from Psalm 34. And Psalm 34, he pointed out, is a psalm, if you read the heading of it, that is when David was on the run, when he ran from Ahimelech after disfiguring himself. So it was a time in David's life when he was fleeing for his life, when he wasn't safe at home, when he was on the run. And yet, during that time of trials, he wrote these words. A little bit later in the same psalm, verse 19 says, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him from them all. So, you know, it's one of those psalms of someone who's going through a hard time. And that's what Steve pointed out, that even though it was a psalm of lament or a psalm of someone who is going through a difficult time, he writes these words about being blessed, about loving life and seeing good days, about the kind of joy that we have in the Lord. And Steve also pointed out that this is quoted in the New Testament by Peter, which we're reading now in 1 Peter 3. And the whole letter of 1 Peter is written to people who were facing a time of trial, facing a time of difficulty. And so we had a lot of discussion about that in class this morning. People around the world who are facing various trials and suffering, and how we can do so with strength and courage. And so that's one connection that we'll see to this. But actually the text that I want to focus on today, that was for our last lesson, which was a few weeks ago from this passage. I want to actually focus on the very next passage, the next paragraph, which is just follows right after that. And this is where we'll pick up on some themes. So this tells us the very next verse in 1 Peter 3. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks your reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. So before I point out some themes and show you how they weave their way through the letter, let's just look at what this particular passage is saying to us. We talked a lot about in this morning fear that we have. fear that we all share as people. But notice that he says, "Have no fear nor be troubled." Like what is there to be afraid of? If we do what is right, for one thing, he points out if you're doing the right thing, really we should not live in fear of being harmed. We shouldn't expect trouble. We should expect that if we're doing the right things, then we are, who is there that's going to harm us if we're zealous for what is good? But although he goes on to say you may have to suffer for that, you may indeed encounter those things, but we should not live in fear of that. I think that's a message that's very needed today. Even though, as John pointed out, in America, we're relative security compared to places around the world. We don't face food insecurity. We don't face, we're not a war-torn country. Yeah, I think if I encounter people all the time who seem to be living in fear, who seem to be afraid of their neighbor, afraid of some random person, afraid of just so many things. And I don't really know why that is. I feel like in my lifetime that has changed. But maybe it's just part of growing up and being more aware. I'm not really sure if it's always been that way. But it just seems like so many people are just afraid of other people, afraid of the future, afraid. And yet, as Christians, we have no reason to be afraid if we are doing the right things. And if we honor Christ, if we are faithful to Him, then there's really no reason to be troubled or afraid. And that should make us different. It should make us stand out so much that somebody might notice and ask about it. Because he says, be prepared to give an answer when someone asks you about the hope that you have. The hope that we have should change how we react to situations because we have hope when a lot of people don't have hope. And that should be something different about us. So we should not be living in fear. Even though I really do feel like a lot of the world is living in fear, we should be different. That should not be how we spend our lives. In verse 15, it's really fascinating. It says, honor Christ the Lord as holy. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. That's an interesting thing to say, isn't it? So we're not going to be afraid, but instead, in our heart, we're going to have the proper honor and respect for Jesus and honor Him as holy, and then always being prepared to make a defense. That's actually a quotation from Isaiah chapter 8, or it's really maybe an allusion to Isaiah 8. Let's read this passage, and you'll see how similar this is to the message that Peter's saying there. Isaiah 8, verse 11. The Lord spoke thus to me with His strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, Him you shall honor as holy. Let Him be your fear. Let Him be your dread. So there's it's obviously not a direct word for word quotation, but it's sort of saying the same thing in slightly different words when you get to Peter's passage. Notice that he says, do not fear or be in dread, but the Lord of hosts honor as holy. And that's the same message, except that in Peter, he says, honor Christ the Lord as holy in your hearts, which is interesting. He applies this to Jesus, this passage from Isaiah. And I think it's also interesting that he says, there were going to be a lot of people in Isaiah's day who were constantly afraid, constantly spying some conspiracy, constantly scared that something was up, something's afoot. And he says, don't be afraid of all the things that everybody around you is afraid of. You just honor God as holy. If you get that right, if you fear the Lord of hosts, Him you shall honor. Let Him be your fear. Let Him be your dread. We see this over and over in the Bible, that if we fear God, fear in the proper sense of honor and reverence and respect, if we keep that right, if we have that right in our heart, then the rest of the things that scare everybody else shouldn't really be scary to us. We have no reason to be afraid of everything else if we have our fear in the right place. And I just found that fascinating and very relevant, especially all the part about conspiracies. I won't even go down that rabbit hole. But there's a lot there that I think is relevant to our time. So, having said all of that, let's now go back to this passage and pick up on as I said, some themes that are throughout this. And really what brought this to my mind is what Steve said in his lesson Wednesday about how Peter's writing to a people who are facing trials and suffering. So one of the themes that is in this passage that I'm going to show you a handful of passages throughout Peter and show you how these same ideas really weave their way through the entire letter. And one of them is the theme of suffering. Even though it comes right after a passage that said, if you want to love life and see good days, do these things. He mentions over and over suffering, and some of the suffering that we face is verbal assault. So notice he does say, who is there to harm you? So there's the theme of harm. And in other words, we shouldn't expect to be in trouble all the time. But even if, verse 14, even if you should, so it may happen, suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. And then in verse 16, he mentions some of these kinds of suffering we might face. Having a good conscience so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. It's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. So one of these things, and I'm going to just, as I said, we're going to have just one after another examples of these, and I'll show you how these themes keep showing up in this letter. One of the themes is suffering. The other is hope, and the hope, specifically the hope of glory. In this particular passage, it's mentioned in this place where it says, be ready always to give a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. So even though we are facing suffering, even though you're facing trials, and maybe because you're facing those things, this hope is going to come shining through. It's going to be evident. People are going to be able to see it, and it may cause them to have questions about, how are you not panicking? How are you handling what you're facing the way that you are? And the reason is really because of this hope that is in us. And it's not mentioned specifically, but it's hinted at in verse 14 that if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Jesus says in the Beatitudes, if we face those things, there is a reward, that we will be blessed if we are counted worthy to suffer for righteousness' sake. So that is our hope. That is something that is an assurance that we can look forward to. And the third thing that I want to point out that's going to show up, not as often as these two, but it does show up in several of these passages, is that we need to be doing good. We need to be doing the right things. So I hope all these colors are not going to go crazy. This is all I'm going to use is 3 colors. There's no more. So hopefully this will be clear. So notice how often it is emphasized that what we can control is what we're doing. And what do we need to be doing? We need to be doing the right things. So who's there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? If you should suffer for righteousness' sake, in other words, for doing the right thing, you will be blessed. And then he says down here, after you give a hope, give an answer for the hope that's within you, having a good conscience, in other words, you don't have anything to be ashamed of in what your behavior is. So when you're slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. It's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. So the 3 things I think that we're going to see as we look through this letter are references over and over and over to the fact that the Christian life is going to at times include suffering. And yet, we have this glorious hope that sees us through it, that will keep us cheerful and give us joy to face those hardships. And all along the way, what we can do and what we must be doing is doing the right things and doing good and living a righteous life. So now that we've kind of identified those things, I want to back up to chapter 1 and just look at some examples where these same themes come up. So in the beginning of the letter, right after the greeting, he opens with this line in chapter 1, verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope. There's our theme of hope and glory. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance, this is the hope, that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Did you hear the Zechariah passage just right there? That's what Kurt read for us from the table. That the third, remember he said he's going to strike the people and 2/3 would be killed and the third would live, but they would be subjected to fire. And he talks about silver and gold being refined by the fire. So again, I don't think this is necessarily a direct quotation word for word from that Zechariah passage. I didn't even make that connection until he was reading it, and it just like a little, rang a bell because I knew that this was in this Peter passage as well. But he refers to there the gold that is perishes even though it is tested by fire. That refining process that they were going to be put to the fire, the refining fire themselves. So he opens with this. Obviously, as you can see, the main emphasis of this passage is on the hope that we have, this living hope, a hope that is something that is kept for us. It's ahead of us. It is kept in heaven. It is stored up. It is undefiled and unfading. Nothing can happen to it to tarnish it, to diminish its value, to take away from it, to make it unreliable. It is permanent. It is kept and guarded, and it is there for us, and we can look forward to that. It will be revealed in the last time, and therefore we can rejoice in this life, even though, verse 6 says, for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. And I think that's, even the way that that's worded, and we saw that in the previous passage, that he doesn't say absolutely 100% of us are going to face these things. John mentioned this in his Bible class. There's people around the world facing things that we're not facing. And there's people in the room going through trials that I'm not going through. And so we don't all face the same things. And he doesn't promise that we will face those, but he says, you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary. So it may be, if you are, you have been grieved by various trials. If we do find ourselves facing those trials, those tests of fire, we can still face it with faith and with joy because of the hope that we have, because we look forward to the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's the first example. Let's look at some more. In the same chapter, chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. So the sequence here is suffering, glory. The suffering comes first, and after the suffering, there's the glory. We see that in Jesus. He left us an example. He came to this earth and he faced suffering, but he did so knowing what was laid up ahead of him, knowing the glory that was awaiting him. And we look at his example, and we can look to his example to draw strength and to draw courage when we face trials, knowing that Jesus suffered first and then was glorified. And we too, if we suffer, will be glorified with him. Verse 13 of chapter 1 says, preparing your minds for action. If you recall, when we did this lesson, a while back, it's that gird up your minds, gird up the loins of your mind. It's like get ready for action. And I highlight that yellow because even though it doesn't mention suffering, in the context of what they were facing, it has that sort of feel to me now that I'm reading back over it. They were about to face a trial by fire. And so he's basically saying, get yourself ready mentally. Prepare yourself. Like, prepare yourself for action. Get ready for, as we noted when we looked at that last time, that same example could be referred to someone who's preparing themselves to fight, preparing for battle. You gird up your loins, and now you're ready to go into the battle. So prepare your minds for action. Be sober-minded. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. There's the hope. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. There's the do good part of this thing. And that is, in other words, you prepare for action. You may face some difficulties. You may face some conflict and suffering. Set your mind on the hope that's laid up. And in the meantime, you be sure that everything you're doing in a way that is holy, trying to live as much as possible like God because God is holy. We want to be holy. Remember in the passage we read, honor Christ the Lord in your heart as holy. So this holiness is another one of those themes, and it should affect all of our conduct. Holiness is all about what we do. It's all about how we conduct ourselves. And we want to conduct ourselves in a holy manner. When we come to chapter 2, again, same thing. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. That's that holy living that he's saying. So that when they speak against you as evildoers, here's the slander that he keeps mentioning. They may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. There's the glory at the end. At the conclusion of all of this, there's going to be glory. But in the meantime, we may face some persecution in the form of, verbal slander, someone talking you down, saying bad things about you. But you don't worry about that. You just keep your conduct pure and hold on to your hope. One of the things that John mentioned in this class about that we fear sometimes is what people will say, right? What are they going to say about me? What will people say? And that might make us afraid to be bold. It might make us afraid to do the things we need to do in following Jesus. And yet he's saying, don't really worry about that. You do the right thing. Keep your conduct holy. Are people going to say stuff about you? Maybe, right? Maybe somebody's going to say you're a freak or you're weird or you're one of those, and they may talk bad about you. And that the fear of that should not stop us from living lives that are holy in our conduct, because in the end, we know how it's going to shake out. We know that in the end, there's going to be glory for those who have put their faith and trust in God. So kind of don't worry about the fact that people will speak against you. They will slander you. They will revile you. That's not something to be afraid of. A little bit later in the same chapter, when he's talking about, in this context, is being subject, and this is the context of servants be subject to your masters, and he applies that to being subject to the government. But anyway, in that context, he says, it's a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. What credit is it if you sin and you're beaten for it, you endure? But if you do good and you suffer, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you've been called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. Now, as I looked at that one, I saw the theme of suffering. There's the theme of doing good. What it doesn't specifically mention is the theme of hope. And yet I think it's hinted at. It's hinted at it when it says this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. In other words, if you suffer for doing the right thing, God is very pleased. Now, it doesn't say that's going to lead to good things happening, but we know that's what that means. If God is pleased with us, that's going to go well for us. And also, he mentions that Jesus suffered, leaving us an example that we might follow in his steps. And we know where his steps lead, don't we? So, yes, if we follow in the steps of Jesus, that path may well lead through suffering. But we know that path is going to lead ultimately to glory. And that is the hope that we have through him. Chapter 4 next. Well, no, chapter 3. So we had one from chapter 3. Another that we started in chapter 3. This passage also from chapter 3. Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. There's the example that he gave us, the steps that we follow. They may well be suffering. A lot of the suffering that Peter mentions is what somebody's going to say about you, how they might talk about you. But it could be as extreme as death. I mean, it spans the whole gamut from somebody just talking you down all the way up to physical abuse and all the way up to possibly facing death. But even as we face whatever we face, we do so with Jesus as our example, knowing that he was, even though he faced all of that, he was made alive in the Spirit. Now, chapter 4. Since, therefore, Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. In verses 12 and 13, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. I have shared, I think, this very passage, if not some others that are like it, like the Beatitudes. When we talked about in class this morning, the people in India and Susanta and are they ever afraid? And the answer is yes, because of the persecution that's going on there. For some of you that don't know this whole backstory, this has been playing out over quite a while. I'll be glad to fill you in later. But there are people who have been killed recently for converting to Christianity from their pagan Hindu religion. It's a very, very difficult time for Christians in India. And that can be frightening, obviously, to them. And I have read some of these verses, and let me tell you, it's a really weird feeling to read this from here, because it's easy for me to say, right? I mean, I'm not facing any of this, but it is what the Bible says. And what it says is that there is a blessing, and that if you face suffering because of your faith in Jesus, that you can rejoice in that because you are sharing in the suffering of Christ. And I actually wonder if we are missing out. In fact, I would say it's probably likely that we are missing out on some blessings for having it so easy, for never having to face that, for never being put in a situation where our faith is tested like that. There's probably some blessings that we're not able to experience because we have it easy. So if someone is put through that kind of fiery trial, then that is something that actually they can rejoice in. It reminds me of, there was a preacher, I don't know if any of you know Gary Kerr. He has a son also named Gary Kerr, which is confusing. Like Norm Webb, senior and junior, we were talking about that with some of our visitors. But anyway, Gary Kerr, the older Gary Kerr, he used to, I don't know if he still does, but he had an email list. And this signature on his email, underneath it, he had a quote. And I always would read it and just think about it. What is he saying? But this is the quote. "The Son of God suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings might be like his." So I read that, I'm like, what? Let me read that again. "The Son of God suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings might be like his." It's a difficult sentence to read. I mean, I thought, that's tough. It turns out, because I remembered it when I read this, and I Googled it, it's a quote from C.S. Lewis in one of his books, and he's quoting from someone else. And so it is an interesting quote. And I often thought, like, I don't even know if I agree with that when I would read it when I was younger. Like, I don't know if I agree. But I think that's what Peter's saying here, that when Jesus came and suffered for sins, he suffered in the flesh. He suffered and died. Why did Jesus do that to spare us from having to face suffering in this life? Clearly not, right? So Jesus didn't suffer so that we could have it easy. He didn't suffer so that we could go through life without any trials or tribulation. But he suffered so that we might suffer like him. That's the part that's kind of tough. But notice what Peter says here is, if you suffer, don't be surprised. Number one, don't be shocked when you suffer. Don't be surprised when some fiery trial comes. In fact, it happens to people all over. But rejoice in as much as you are sharing Christ's sufferings. Rejoice and be glad that you may rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. So if we are able to suffer for the name of Christ, we can actually take a lot of comfort in the fact that we are sharing in the same kind of suffering that Jesus suffered, and that was obviously part of God's plan. Again, back to the passage Kurt read, the third who lived, they would be subjected to fire because they would be purified, and that's what God is looking for. So he struck the shepherd, and then the ones that were his, he refined in the furnace. And so that is God's plan, that the shepherd suffered, not that everybody else would not suffer, but that everybody else would suffer like him and be refined and then share in this hope of glory. And so it's really, I think, a profound kind of statement, and I think it's supported here by what Peter is writing. Okay, let's look at an example or two from chapter 5. Peter opens chapter 5 by saying, "I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that's going to be revealed." So again, suffering, glory. When you think about Peter himself, he says, I was alive to see it. He saw Jesus. He saw what happened to Jesus. He saw him being arrested. He saw all the things that Jesus was going through leading up to the crucifixion before he fled. He witnessed that. And not only did he see that, but he himself was a partaker in some of those persecutions. And we know that Jesus told him, and at the end of John, as we studied recently, that Peter himself one day would have his hand stretched out. Another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And this was to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after this, he said, follow me. So Peter, just like, Jesus knew all along where his path was going. Imagine from that day on, Peter knew that how his story was going to end. Now, maybe not all the specifics and details, but imagine carrying that knowledge around with you that one of these days it's going to end this way. And yet Peter continued to serve God. Why? Because he said he was a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. He was sharing in the glory already in advance. We do that by hope. We do that through hope. All right, back to chapter 5. This is one of the most well-known passages in this, the whole letter. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. John talked about that in class. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing the same kind of sufferings are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. After you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Again, suffering, glory. Notice the contrast, though. Suffered a little while, compared to eternal glory. The suffering is short, the glory is eternal. Paul says the same thing in 2 Corinthians. This light momentary affliction. And Michael brought up in class, there's a place where Paul lists the things he's experienced, and he just lumps all that in as it's just light. It's just light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Again, the suffering leads to the glory. As we look not to the things that are seen, the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are transient. The things that are unseen are eternal. What we face in the here and now, no matter how bad it is, no matter what it is, it's going to pass. It's going to be temporary. My grandmother used to say, she had a quote from Latin that is, oh man, I shouldn't have started without remembering the whole thing. But anyway, whatever we face now is going to pass. And one day, perhaps it will even seem sweet. And so, the light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory. Perhaps there's someone here this morning who needs to make something right in your life. If you're not living that life that is a life of holiness and godliness, then you can't have the comfort of the expectation of glory. The hope that we have comes from the fact that we know we are following in the steps of Jesus. And if you're doing things your own way and you're not following Jesus, then you're going some other direction. And there's no hope in that direction. There's no happy ending down that path. The only happy ending is in the path that follows the steps of Jesus. When we get off of that path, we start heading into darkness, we start heading into trouble, and it ultimately leads to death. And so if we get on the right path, it's still going to be hard, but we know at the end of this path, there's glory. So we can face those trials with comfort, with joy, with hope. And if there's someone who needs to make your life right and we can be of assistance, please let us know while we stand and sing.